Now I'm the last speaker of the day. So I have to find out ways of keeping you awake or stopping you from leaving. Um, Emily mentioned my background, but I think my biggest credibility or biggest reason why I should be talking to you is I was born in Kenya. And we lived long enough in Kenya to learn how to swear in Swahili. So I'm warning all you East Africans here who basically going to ask tough questions that I can reply in Swahili and even swear at you. So for that reason, I like to start my talk by talking about something which my friend Ian Smiley said, that despite all the immense wealth that Africa has, why is it that we have 400 million people still in poverty? Why is it we're having greater inequalities of wealth in Africa? And I was looking at some stats which Ian mentioned, but some others. And think about a continent which did not have a colonial history, which had the world's largest resources in gold, in platinum, in chrome, magnesium, vanadium, cobalt, diamonds, potentially the largest offshore gas reserves in the world, potentially major oil and gas finds in the future, including in the country which should be the wealthiest country in the world, the DRC, which is not the wealthiest country for all the reasons that were mentioned. So why is this happening? Well, I hate to be a sort of a cynic at the end of this day after some of the good news we've heard, but the facts are that despite this massive wealth that should be the foundation, that should make Africa own the 21st century, we have almost every day a daily stream of too many extractive industry projects in Africa, which are met by nonviolent and sometimes violent protests, disruptions, delays, accusations of human rights violations, and ramped up opposition by local communities, in addition to the number of disputes between foreign companies and companies extractive in these countries. Again, I hate to sort of be the cynic in terms of CSR, which Lilith has been talking about, but perhaps it's time to acknowledge that corporate social responsibility, not only by the extractive industries, but a whole range of others, have not lived up to the challenge posed by the opposition to local communities, given the seriousness allegations that are now appearing, ranging from complicity in human rights abuses, environmental degradation, and the fueling of local conflicts. And in the DRC, that's what it's all about. I appreciated the comments made by the representative from the DRC. People forget that that country experienced Africa's first global world war. 6 other nations were fighting to get its resources. So how can you say that they did not suffer massive, and still to this day suffer, massive exploitation by others not within their own country? So I think it's time to acknowledge that maybe there is a root cause that goes beyond CSR, that goes beyond the fact that Africa has all this wealth which should make it own the 21st century. My suggestion is that the root cause is the perceived failure on the part of local communities, that they are increasingly losing their ability to govern their own futures, and to have a meaningful consultation in the extractive projects that seriously and directly affect their local communities. Now, this is not only relevant to Africa. We see the same thing happening in Latin America, we see the same thing happening in parts of Asia, and I predict the same thing will happen in China, where you see internal conflict happening. So what's at the root cause of this growing concern and growing feeling that CSR and some of the initiatives we've been talking about today is not working? Well, I am going to emphasize that one of the reasons is the fact that these local communities are getting the sense they're losing control of their futures, their sustainable development, and their livelihood. So what's the answer? Well, let me go back a little bit in history, that prior to the appearance of some of the issues that Lalith has already talked about, CSR and FPIC, the free, prior, and informed consent, Let's go back to the 1980s, when it became clear that, like Latin America, Africa was going to be a very hot spot because of the rising prices in commodities. When it became clear that China and the other emerging economies was going to need Africa's commodities, there was a rush for the extractive industries around the world to come into Africa. And so what were the Western companies who went into Africa and Latin America, what were their major concerns? Well, I've been in this area now for close to 30 years, and I've spoken to many of those companies, and I've asked them, what was your main concerns when you rushed into Africa, when you rushed into Latin America? And what they told me was they were mainly concerned about risks. They were concerned about political risks, reputational risks, operational risks, legal risks, and that was their major concern. And that's why, even in those earlier times, they started developing codes of conduct, dealing with political risk, operational risk, etc. What they ignored, however, that despite them covering their own risks, that the impact on local communities in terms of their interests, their livelihoods, their land use, their desire to have equal sharing of benefits was missing. And so towards the end of the 20th century, after that 1980s to the end of the last century, many local communities, not only in Africa, but Latin America too, began to feel they were losing control of their futures, their sustainable development, and started demanding a greater control over their futures in the language of human rights, and a growing desire to have honest, effective, and real participation and consent in those projects. Now, what I find really interesting in my research in this area, that finally the major mining associations are starting to accept this. The International Council on Mining and Metals, they've done their own research in this area, and they've actually come to the conclusion too that the major root cause of many of these oppositions around the world is the fact that these local communities are starting to lose a sense that they are controlling their own futures, their own sustainable development, and their own livelihoods. In the 1990s, CSR started appearing on the scene and said, well, how do we deal with this? Well, the first attempts from the 1990s onwards was, let's try and develop links with local NGOs. We'll deal with local communities and talk to them how much we care about their social, their environmental, and their economic impacts of the projects. Very soon, the World Bank picked up on this, and as you know, they started establishing, especially the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, started establishing mandatory project requirements and safeguards which focused on environment and social issues, and as far as indigenous people were concerned, special focus on them too. Even the IFC, the so-called banner for the Washington Consensus, said, well, we're starting to realize you can't just satisfy the national governments. You absolutely have to start thinking about how do you actually deal with the local communities that are going to be an integral part of the major extractive projects. What's interesting is that the companies themselves and their associations and a whole bunch of others decided, well, maybe the route to go is multi-stakeholder arrangements. So a whole bunch of multi-stakeholder arrangements started appearing from the mid-1990s to the early part of this century. You had the Global Compact, which I was involved in helping develop it. I drafted the human rights principles in the Global Compact. You then had the US voluntary principles on security and human rights. You had the Extractive Industry Initiative, the Kimberley process, which Ian Smiley has to take immense credit for. And ultimately, you had the ICMM focusing on sustainable development frameworks. However, my thesis is that even these multi-stakeholder approaches and traditional CSR was not sufficient to address the core of the growing frustration by local communities that they did not have equal negotiating power with not only the major foreign extractive companies, but with their own host government, their own home governments. And so many of them basically said, well, what's next? we're not getting what we really want from CSR, which I acknowledge is very important. How else can we absolutely insist that we need to have a greater sense of bargaining power with the extractive industry companies and our own home governments? It was at this stage that the indigenous groups in Latin America started saying, well, maybe we should start talking about a whole new paradigm. And that paradigm should be free, prior, and informed consent. And because of the fact that there had been major disasters taking place in Latin America, which I actually have seen firsthand, some of those disasters, having audited some of the multi-billion-dollar projects, they started insisting on maybe the new paradigm should be free, prior, and informed consent. And through their lobbying, not only amongst Latin American indigenous groups, but other indigenous groups across the world, they finally succeeded. In 2007, when the United Nations eventually developed the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and 143 nations endorsed it, not Canada, not the United States, not Australia, and not New Zealand. Why? Because they were worried that that would basically upset a lot of their existing frameworks. Ultimately, when they realized that this was a moving train which they could not just ignore, eventually all of them, eventually Canada used the word endorsed. We endorsed the 2007 United Nations Declaration. And what this declaration said, and the critical article is Article 32, is that it demands that we move from consulting and harvesting opinions of local communities to participation in decision-making at all stages of the project. It goes way beyond just saying, well, you know, we've done our environmental impact assessment. We've done our social impact assessment. Here it is. Goodbye. No. What this movement is now saying is that we want to be active participants from the very start in how you participate with us in having decision-making power. The indigenous peoples in Latin America were the moving force behind this, but I'm predicting that it's going to start applying beyond Latin America to local communities around the world, including in Africa. But this paradigm faces the following dangers. The consent part of FPIC, free, prior, informed consent, cannot be coerced or bullied or bribed. The consent must be obtained for all aspects of the project, from the exploration stage all the way to production stage. The consent must also include informing communities in their own language, their own traditions, and giving them the capacity. A lot of people talked about capacity today, giving them the capacity to understand what the real impacts of this multi-billion-dollar project is going to be on their livelihoods, on their sustainable development. And if they don't get that, any form of consent will ultimately be illusory. The consent has to be also continuous, that even after the project is started, that it has to be all the way through, including having an effective grievance mechanism, which I predict the absence of that is going to cause a lot of problems to multi-billion-dollar projects around the world if they do not have an effective grievance mechanism attached to the free, prior, and informed consent. Now, some people may say, well, it may alleviate the concerns of local communities, but what if it annoys the national government? I'll get to that in a moment. The practical challenges facing FPIC are the following. First of all, international financial institutions and the extractive industry themselves are saying, even if we accept free, prior, and informed, we have a problem with consent, because we do not want consent to mean veto. And so even the World Bank's Extractive Industry Review initially said, yes, there should be consent, but the management group of the World Bank said, no, we're not going to go that far. We want to talk about consultation. The International Council on Mining and Minerals also basically said, we can accept everything but that final part. And it's just not time right now to have full consent. Perhaps what constitutes consent is probably the most controversial of all. In Latin America, you're starting to see very innovative possible solutions such as referendums, community task forces, community contracts. Actually, Doug, you've actually given an example of impact-benefit agreements. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in this, but one of the things which I'm insisting that I can't read how much time is left, so I'm going to assume it's going to be lots. One of the things which I think when people attack free, prior, and informed consent by saying, well, consent is not possible, vetoes are not consent, I consider that a straw man. Because having spoken to many companies, and there are starting to be a few companies who are starting to think about the consent, as long as you are committed to an effective participatory decision-making process, I think that goes some way towards consent. And unless you can show that you have developed that bargaining level where people feel they are treated as equal in this participatory process, that could satisfy the consent requirements. Now, the host government issue. Many of the host governments would say, well, this is not our agenda, this is the local community's agenda, it's being fostered by northern NGOs and other activists, it's not our agenda. My answer to that is that when you look at what's happened in Latin America, and now starting in Africa, if national governments don't accept that there has to be free, prior, and informed consultation, real effective participation, there's grave dangers that those national projects could actually be stopped anyway. So it's in your interest, in the long run, to move forward to this new paradigm. If I had more time, I could tell you that even the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, I've been involved with the World Bank in their safeguards review in New York City. Even they are starting to think, well, maybe it's time to move a little bit further than just saying, well, we just got to harvest your opinions. And I could talk about that. But I want to finish off with a quote from an African expert about the record of the extractive industry in Africa. And this is what he says. His name is what is his name? I'll get to his name. But this is what he said. Local communities suffer varied and complex adverse impacts of mining. Some have suffered militaristic attacks. Many have lost their property and land in return for a pittance in compensation. Thousands of community have been displaced and angled out of their livelihood sources by large-scale mining companies. To a great majority of communities, the lived history of corporate mining is an instrument of destruction, exploitation, and alienation from the history, culture, and livelihoods. I could go on, I'll leave that. Now, he also says that Canada and Canadian mining companies has a lot of blame to take part in this. So I want to leave with an optimistic hope. There is now growing evidence that local communities in Latin America, local communities in Africa are teaming up with social movements in the north, and what's interesting, with some leadership companies. Most recently, according to Oxfam, 5 companies, Inmet, Newmont, Rio Tinto, Talisman, and Extractive, have made explicit public comments that they are willing to move towards free, prior, and informed consent. Others, like BHP Billiton, are saying, well, we're not quite there, but we may actually get there soon. Anglo-American too. So what I'm going to finish off by basically saying is, whether or not you agree with me, you have to look at what's on the ground, and this is going to be the next level: free, prior, and informed consent. And if those who wish to ignore it, the arc of the extractive industry's future must turn towards endorsing and fully implementing the core principles of free, prior, and informed consent, or at least effective, consultative, participatory decision-making with the companies. Thank you.